Thank you, Rick. Before I introduce, which needs no introduction, obviously, I left out one other upcoming event. It's March 28th. It's our very famous movie night, Men's Club movie night. For more information, you can talk to Farshad Rafi, our VP of Programming. Rabbi Dr. Bradley Shabbat Artson holds the Abner and Rosalind Goldstein Dean Chair of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies and is the Vice President of American Jewish University in Los Angeles. Rabbi Artson has long been a passionate advocate for social justice, human dignity, diversity, and inclusion. Rabbi Artson is the author of 12 books and over 250 articles. His newest book is Renewing the Process of Creation, a Jewish integration of science and spirit. He also became a leading voice advocating for LGBT marriage and orientation in the 90s. You can frequent the rabbi's article on the Huffington Post and for the Times of Israel, and follow him on his Facebook. He has over 30,000 followers, which is 29,950 more than me. I would like to welcome our wonderful friend and wonderful Rabbi Artson.
Shalom, friends. It's always nice to be at Sinai and to be with so many familiar faces. So I was thinking about the topic I was assigned is how does Judaism, how does religion contribute to us as individuals? And there's a safe way to give that talk, and then there's a not safe way to give the talk. You know where this is heading. So the safe way to give the talk would just be to highlight some interesting individuals at different points in Jewish history, pick one or two from the Bible, pick one or two from the Talmud, maybe a couple pre-moderns. If I could throw in an early Zionist, I win points, and then be done. But we're friends, and so I'm not going to play it safe tonight. I want to pose a challenge to you. Here's the challenge. The American idea of an individual is radically at odds with the Jewish idea of what it means to be an individual. And if we can't have that conversation, then I'm going to give this talk with one hand tied behind my back. Because I'm not going to be able to talk about what Judaism imagines is possible for an individual. So we need to deconstruct a little, we need to take apart, and I do that with full appreciation of the fact that the only reason we can have this talk here is because America is extraordinary, and because it's a place that allows for the kind of conversation we're going to have. So the American ideal is born out of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment came up with the radical and unprecedented notion that you are who you are, separate from everybody else. So that I'm Brad, and I shouldn't be defined by my age, or my gender, or my race, or my religion. As far as the US government is concerned, I'm just my Social Security number. And so long as I pay my taxes, that's pretty much all they ask of me. Occasionally, jury duty, Although between you and me, they never let me actually serve on a jury. I don't know if it's when I tell them that I'm a rabbi that bumps me off, when I tell them that my wife is a federal prosecutor that bumps me off, but for one reason or another, I've never actually been impaneled in a jury. That seems to be the good judgment of the American government that there are limits as to where I can go. But to be an American citizen is to be an individual with no labels. You have as much a right to your opinion as the next person. You have the much right to enter into the public sphere as the next person. You have the right to live your life in however you want, with the limit of you're not allowed to hurt someone else. But so long as you're not hurting someone else, then according to the American Enlightenment ideal, it's nobody's business what you do, what kinds of choices you make. And there are huge benefits that have come about because of that ideal. I do think that American enterprise, the kind of creativity, the ways that we have boldly expanded the realms of human knowledge and human comfort, are all of them directly related to that, and certainly most of the social justice movements in this country owe their claim to a kind of fundamentalist ideal from the Enlightenment that everybody has certain rights, right? We all know that that's enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, right? These truths are self-evident, the rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and notice there's no mention of what caste you're part of, or what guild, or what group. That's the Enlightenment ideal. But here's the problem with that ideal. By itself, it leaves you lonely and isolated. The reality is, none of us are just a citizen. We are each of us the sum total of everything we bring into our life. Who our parents were or are, who our siblings were or are, our children, our neighbors, the people we hang out with, the people we want to talk to, where we got our education, if we got an education, the nature of work that we do, who we spend our time with, what's our faith, how do we practice it. All of that makes a big difference for who we are. So the first thing I want to say about Judaism and the individual is that Judaism has a very different notion about what being an individual is. And it turns out that the Jewish ideal of an individual is much more reflective of world civilization than the American ideal. America and Western Europe are weird. They are Western, educated, industrial, right? They are democratic, small d, and they're rich. Weird, right? And that's not how the rest of the world looks. The rest of the world is much more communitarian than the enlightened slice of the world. And they see things very differently. So let me point out one of the biggest differences, and then I want to go into Judaism a little bit as a corrective. In the part of the world that is weird, Western, educated, industrial, rich, democratic, that's what it stands for. In that part, got it? Wait, I'm not just saying, weird isn't a value judgment. Weird is those five things. I'm obviously being too subtle. Okay.
Western, educated, industrial, enlightened, and rich?
Rich and democratic, because you have to spell weird.
Very good.
Oh, weird.
You got it.
Did you
I don't know.
come up with
No, I'm not that smart. I'm just a rabbi. There's a social scientist whose last name is Haight, H-A-I-G-H-T, who wrote a book called The Righteous Mind. It's an amazing, amazing book. In it, he talks about why people have differences of political or religious convictions and why we don't listen to each other. Right? And the good news is at the end of the book he has some suggestions for what might help. But one of the things he points out that I had never thought about before is that liberals, political liberals, when they talk about their political values, they have basically two values in mind. One is they mean equality. They talk about equality as a fundamental liberal value. And by equality, they don't mean equality of opportunity. They mean equality of benefits. Equality of benefits. Everybody deserves a certain minimal health care. Everyone deserves a certain level of housing. Everyone deserves a certain level of education, right? The liberal agenda, I'm not being pro or con here, I'm just laying it out. The liberal agenda focuses on equality of opportunity, right? Of outcome. Of benefit. And the second thing that they focus on is lack of harm. Right? That people have the right not to be assaulted. That, by the way, has been a real strength of liberalism across the last 250 years. The notion that you don't get to enslave people because of their race, or you shouldn't withhold the vote from women just because they're women, or you should be able to be gay and public about it. All of those comes out from the liberal insistence that freedom and liberty has to be freedom from oppression, personal, individual oppression. So those are the two basic liberal values. Conservatives, when they're tested, they value those two, although not as much. And when they talk about freedom and equality, by equality they don't so much mean equality of outcome as equality of opportunity. Everybody should have a shot at whatever, and then however it turns out for you, that's how it turns out for you. That's more the conservative ideal. But they also supplement it with certain things that the liberals, when tested, just don't value. Tradition is something that conservatives value a great deal, and liberals practically not at all, right? So liberals don't mind tradition if it's trivial. You want to serve apple pie on the 4th of July? That's a tradition we can get behind. But a tradition that makes demands on you, many liberals, when tested, feel repelled by, because you're intruding on their autonomy. Remember? And that kind of freedom from that kind of constraint is a very high liberal value. Right? So the notion of tradition as a value, conservatives often speak about that as a very important value. How has it been done before? And shouldn't the burden be, we're going to do it the way it's been done, unless someone demonstrates that we shouldn't anymore? Okay? So that kind of tradition is very important. Freedom as lack of external coercion. Right? Don't tread on me is a popular, now conservative slogan. I do want to point out that when Don't Tread on Me first started, it was a liberal slogan. Right? But not treading on you is now something that's on a right-wing bumper sticker, not a left-wing bumper sticker. Right? Again, I'm not endorsing one way or the other. I just want to point it out. So what do you do then with the notion of an individual is someone who is enmeshed in a larger cultural matrix? Right? For a liberal, often, the ideal is we are free to invent ourselves. And we invent ourselves as we choose to, with no limitations. There have been good things that have come out of that, but by and large, I have to tell you, the societies that have worked on social engineering as their primary mode of change have not done very well. And the conservative movement, I'm not talking here Republican and Democrat, I'm not talking Trump and other, well, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about approaches to the world. The conservative approach is based, in some ways, on a skepticism about human nature. The notion that people left to their own devices will do whatever they think they can get away with. Right? So that it's not that you want people making their own choices all the time, because people will make really rotten choices. They will choose what they think no one's looking, and so no one will see. Right? How differently do you slice the pie for dessert if your spouse is watching you cut the pie? As opposed to everyone's gone to bed and you know there's still pie in the kitchen. Plato, the Greek philosopher, wrote a case study, a mental experiment called Glaucon's ring. Glaucon was a guy who had this imaginary ring that made you invisible and made no one hear you. How would you behave if you could slip on that ring? Well, it turns out they've done studies in which they've given people hypotheticals that are like that, and they have found out people don't live up to their own ideals. Right? That often the way we behave is based on social pressure and trained behavior. Okay, so if conservative says we need to maintain a healthy respect for tradition because our traditions are what civilize us. Our traditions are what keep our unbridled lusts restrained. And the last thing you want to have is a community where you just do whatever you feel like doing whenever you feel like doing it. That's going to wind up badly. So how do we moderate between this? When they've tested liberals, they come out very strong on those two values, and then when you ask them about more conservative values, authority, tradition, standards, liberals, frankly, are very suspicious. Let me just defend liberals for a minute by saying that the reason they're often suspicious is because tradition and authority have been used by people who hold the power to keep everybody else out of the power. So liberals have earned their distrust of that. But conservatives take a look at the last 100 years. They look, for example, at Marxist countries around the world, which radically rejected tradition and authority and turned out as bad or worse than the societies they were replacing. So conservatives tend to want to move very slowly. They tend to want to change as little as possible, as late as possible. I know we're moving far afield from individualism, but I'm going to circle back now. So what happens if, like me, you're in the middle? What happens, and I imagine a fair amount of the people at Sinai Temple are in the middle too, very committed to individual liberty, very committed to making sure that the poor don't starve and don't wind up on the street, very committed to holding people accountable for their own choices, and pretty convinced that if people were left to their own devices, they would try to get away with awful things. So we need to have pretty strong standards in place to keep them in check. What do we do in the middle? Well, here's where I want to talk about the genius of Judaism. Because the genius of our tradition is that it fashions individuals who define themselves as part of something bigger. I'm not just Brad Artson. I'm Brad Artson, who's part of the Jewish community. And that means there are certain things I identify with automatically. It means that if I'm a religious Jew, and I am, it means that I'm reading the Torah every single week. And so I'm in conversation with a set of values and a set of narratives that identify who I am and locate me in terms of my values and my priorities. It's not a coincidence that our key story in the world is about having started as slaves and having been brought to freedom into our own land. It's also not a coincidence that the story stops before we get into the land. Because I'll tell you, for those of you who haven't peeked ahead of the book of Deuteronomy, the story of what we did in the land is a disaster. We did not behave well. We did not make good Jewish choices. But what does it mean then to raise a child, or to raise ourselves, with these stories as who we are all the time? Every week, I sit down and I read about Moses and the children of Israel. I read about a God who says you have to love the stranger. A God who says you pay the laborer on the same day as the laborer's work. A God who says you let the earth rest. All of these laws and stories that have made Jews mensches for thousands of years and carried us in times where we were impoverished or despised or endangered with an internal compass, an internal sense of right and wrong that allowed us to flourish. Now, the way we had to work that through, that's very un-American, is my choices were not just decided by does anyone get hurt by it or not. It turns out that to be a member of the Jewish community, I owe you people more than that. I owe you more than just not hurting somebody. I have to ask myself additional questions. Does my choice reflect well on the Jewish community or not? I'm probably not the only one in this room who reads the newspaper Jewishly. You know what it means to read the newspaper Jewishly? I flip through the paper to make sure that none of us are getting indicted. And I also read it to make sure that Israel's not in trouble. Right? So I do a quick scan of the paper. Anyone from Sinai Temple who is getting prosecuted? No? Okay, good. Right? Is Bibi about to get thrown in for the international court? No? Good. Okay, then I go back and I read the paper from the front page again. Now we laugh, but we laugh because we all feel that sense of identification. Right? I'm touched by your choices. You're impacted by my choices. How we behave in the world affects each of us. And so our sense of who we are as an individual is, I'm a Jewish individual. And that's not just a small thing. That's not just a label. It isn't just my religion, right? You can be a very engaged Jew and not believe in God. You can be a very committed Jew and not observe the Sabbath laws. Don't tell the clergy I said that. But you can't be a very good Jew and not care about other Jews. Right? I personally don't think you could be a very good Jew and not love Israel. Right? So there are ways in which, and we can argue about what loving Israel means. We can argue about what loving other Jews means. We do argue about it. That's part of our being Jewish. But the kind of individual I am is an individual shaped by the other people in my life. And some of those people I've never met. The patriarchs, Moses, Rabbi Akiva, Theodore Herzl. I never met these people, but their choices shape my life. And I choose that. That's where the American part sneaks back in. In this country, we're free to walk away. If I don't want to be Jewish Brad Artson, I could stop. But I made that choice long ago. I can't. So what Judaism offers us is a richer sense of what being an individual is. You are not who you are separate from the world around you. You are who you are tied up in the world around you. Let me give you a couple examples out of the realm of biology. It turns out that babies in utero can discern their parents' voices. They respond differently to their mother's voice and their father's voice than they do to other adult voices. It means that when they're born, they're already primed to know their parents. That's astonishing, isn't it? It means we used to think of babies as a blank slate, and then the experiences of life wrote on the baby's blank slate, but that's not true. The baby is born set up to be a particular kind of person before they're even born. They've already inherited tastes of music, foods, voices. They already come into the world set up and ready to go. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
And then that continues in life. We are continually, thank you, Abner. We are continually pruning our neurons so that by the time you hit your teenage years, your brain is unlike any other brain on the planet. You've strengthened some neural connections, you've allowed others to atrophy, right? To reflect your own experiences in life, which is why you'll resonate to certain things that the person next to you won't. Right? It means there's no such thing as a brain in abstract. There's no such thing as an individual in abstract. There are only each one of us carrying all the choices we've made up until that moment. And we do that, excuse me, armed with a tradition that asks of us certain opportunities for becoming. So what do we do with Jewish kids? Right? The first thing we do is we raise them hopefully in families in which there are all these times to celebrate together. So I want to hold out for you something extraordinary. You know, we take for granted that the biggest party we throw in our family pre-marriage is when a kid turns 13. Do you know how smart that is? Right? At the very moment when parents and children are at their most strained, they're about to go into this dark hole of teenageness, we take a deep breath, we pause, and we celebrate the kid. Every Jewish teenager is burdened by the knowledge that at one point their parents loved them. Crippling, I know. And every Jewish parent harkens back to a day when their kid was perfect. Right? And that gets you more or less through 18 or so. But think about what the tradition is then doing in molding individuals. Right? You are permanently made with your child's image embedded in your heart. Not just biologically, but our culture brings us back to it again and again. Every Friday night, I and Jewish parents around the world bless our children with the same blessing that we've been blessing kids with for thousands of years, right? The priestly benediction. And the kids know every week that their parents think they're a blessing, think that they're worth blessing. That's an extraordinary gift to take with you through life. At the time in life when your parents are no longer physically available to you, you can summon up that blessing every time you need it. That never goes away. Well, that means that the kind of individual you are is an individual who carries their parents' blessing every day of their life. That's enormous. That changes mammal brains. Right? And it's not just that. We have all these amazing holidays. So let me share with you, when my kids were 3, I built a sukkah outside. Everybody does a sukkah outside if they're building a sukkah. But I built mine with a mattress on the floor because I told the kids we were going to spend the night in the sukkah. You have never experienced the joy of being Jewish until you wake up in the middle of the night with 3-year-olds asleep on both sides. So Shira's sleeping over here, Jacob's sleeping over here, the moon and the stars above the roof. And you know what it means to be protected. And you know what it means to be part of something fragile and beautiful and transforming. But whether you slept in the sukkah or not, you've had a Seder. The Seder's a party for the kids to get involved, isn't it? Right? All of those adorable Manish Tana singings, right? That's the centerpiece. We've made our most important religious festival in the home, not in the synagogue, and we've oriented it so that it's around the kids. That doesn't happen in other traditions. So again and again, what Judaism says is, yes, by all means you should be an individual, but individual doesn't mean blank slate. It means defined by our traditions. It means shaped and augmented by our traditions. It means that there are things possible because we're Jewish that otherwise would not be possible for us. So the question I want to ask, and then I'm going to stop and we can talk together a bit, is how do we navigate as Americans and as Jews a Judaism that leaves room for individual distinctiveness and at the same time strengthens us so that we're there for each other and so that we carry each other inside our hearts even when we're not physically in the same room. So I want to close with a short story if I could. Many of you know my son Jacob. Jacob is now 24. He's actually spoken to the Men's Club before, so some of you were here for that talk. We have family in Israel. Ilana's brother made Aliyah. Her parents were Israeli, came to LA, but her brother made Aliyah and married an Israeli woman. They have some beautiful adult children now. What do you do if you're an Israeli who wants to improve your English? Well, if your uncle is a rabbi, you call your uncle and you say, "Can you get me a job at Camp Ramah?" Because as much as Camp Ramah is a good place to teach Americans Hebrew, it's an excellent place to turn to teach Israelis English. So my nephew Rui came to stay with us for a week before going to Ramah. And being that he's a typical Israeli, he did in fact own a pair of tefillin that he hadn't used since his bar mitzvah. So they were spanking new, beautiful, crisp, crackly leather, right? And we had the privilege of trying to teach a secular Israeli how to put on tefillin without getting strangled. It was for an hour a Monty Python scene. Roi and the killer tefillin. My job was to intervene as they were wrapping themselves around his throat and pulling them off of him back to safety. And we spent an hour with me making sure that he didn't get killed by these tefillin. At the end of an hour, Jacob, who had been downstairs watching this the whole time, came over and he handed me his buddy board, which is, he has a typing implement, there's a buddy board, right, with a keyboard on it, and Jacob uses it to communicate and to type just like Jeffrey. And Jacob typed, "Roi, you are so lucky to be able to put on tefillin, because I've always wanted to wear tefillin and I can't." Right? His sensory, it's too hard for him to deal with that touch. Of course, that breaks my heart, doesn't it? So I said to him, "Jacob, I have two things to tell you." I said, the first is, in Jewish tradition, any mitzvah that you sincerely intend to fulfill, but you can't for reasons that you don't have control over, you get full credit. So in God's eyes, you've been putting on your tefillin every day since your bar mitzvah. But that's not good enough. So from now on, in the morning, I'm going to daven with you.
It's not nice.
All right, so every morning, I get up, Jacob joins me downstairs.